Hi again, Brian Fraser back with the Jesus, Jazz and Worship project at Brentwood Presbyterian Church in Burnaby, BC. A project that's funded by the Vital Worship grants from Calvin Institute of Christian Worship, in turn funded by the Lilly Endowment, Inc., and a generous grant from Canada's Summer Jobs for students who have done research over the summer with ministers, with musicians, and with people who attend jazz worship services. So our idea is to dig more deeply into the dynamics of jazz worship services. What's actually going on there? How is Jesus encountering people through jazz in worship? So that's kind of the focus of the whole project. And on these channels, you'll find interviews from time to time and various posts from time to time. So keep up with us, and we'd love to hear your responses and get your feedback and bring you into that ongoing conversation that is the project. One of the things that we had done for the project is the image that you see sitting behind me on the piano. This is by a wonderful local Vancouver artist by the name of Laura Zarabeski. Earlier she did an image of the church, which captures the kind of energy of the church, and especially the energy that fills this church when we do jazz worship services. But for the bulletin, the order of service for our Jazz Vespers, Jazz Evensong, every Wednesday night at 8 o'clock. And if you're in the Vancouver area or visiting the Vancouver area, you're more than welcome to join us at 8 o'clock Wednesday night, Brentwood Presbyterian Church, 1600 Delta Avenue in Burnaby, BC. That's the plug. She did a line drawing of this image. She calls it the Spirit of Jazz. We call it the Trinity Trio. But I wanted to just, as you look at this image, just read a little bit about from her interpretation of it. Trinity Trio started as a simple line drawing to illustrate the following passage. And this passage is kind of the tagline for Jazz Evensong at Brentwood, where God the Creator lays down the bass line, where Jesus Christ the Redeemer calls the melodies, and where the Holy Spirit the Energizer jams with the harmonies of joy. So that's the tagline for Jazz Evensong here at Brentwood. And Laura picked up particularly on the idea of the Holy Spirit, the Energizer. So how does one portray both jazz music and spirituality visually? Jazz music that expresses the range of human emotions played by the players who are collaborative and improvisational. It's also inherently joyful and accepting, because the idea behind a good jam or an improv session is always to say yes without judgment. I love that phrase. And build on each other's musical suggestions. So it's a conversation. It's an ongoing conversation. You build that performance, one conversation after another. I think that's how you build a church and a Christian community, one conversation after another. And one could always say, as Laura says, this is a facet of spirituality. Now, one of the things that we discovered in our interviews, and the 4 jazz students who worked with us over the summer of 2018 did about maybe 75 interviews, mostly with musicians, but also with ministers and people who attend jazz worship services. But what they found, especially with the musicians, was the musicians felt more comfortable talking about the role of spirituality in their music if we used that language, if we weren't specific to a particular religious tradition or a religious community. That may be more common out here on the West Coast, the most secular part of North America, whether you're in Canada or the United States, where people will often say, well, I'm spiritual but not religious. Another dimension of that is that they're not into joining a community. They will participate, but they won't go so far as to join. And so we found in the language that we were using in the interviews, if we use jazz and spirituality, the musicians especially were much more open in talking about the way in which the energy of the Spirit, what we would call the energy of the Spirit, was at work in and through their music. There are a couple of things that were particularly telling to me, and we're still in the early stages of analyzing the data that these students collected, and we'll continue to collect it over the year. One was, again, what the scholars call hybridity. It's this amazing mix of influences that come together. And in some ways it isn't surprising because jazz is a hybrid musical form. It brings elements of African rhythms and of gospel and of soul, and in more recent jazz, connections with classical music. I mean, it's all an intriguing and creative mix of all of these influences. And what we were finding, especially among the musicians, is the same kind of mix. Many of them had Christian backgrounds. They'd been raised in the Christian faith. They'd either become bored and indifferent with it, or in some cases, it really had been very harmful and toxic to them as individuals. Interestingly enough, the church was not seen to be a place where their interest in jazz was welcome. We're certainly trying to change that. But jazz wasn't seen to be a form of music that really belonged in church. We think jazz does belong in church. And so that's part of what we want to dig into more deeply. And the inspiration that Laura has provided in this painting. And so I just wanted to talk about it. She would see herself as a kind of expressionist. And so she says, the expressionists use color and rapid brushstrokes to depict emotion. I wanted to show a dynamic force that has expressive and generous qualities, so I used color. All the colors, rainbows symbolize inclusiveness, variety, beauty, and even reward via the myth of the pot of gold at the end of the rainbow. The expressionists would set colors against their opposites, because red is always redder against green, and blue is bluer against orange. Like a good jam session, each color has to combine with the others without losing itself, and thereby make a more vital and vivid whole. The swirls mimic and exaggerate the effect of light through smoke, as one might see in stained glass, or incense, or even neon signage in the cigarette smoke of the old jazz clubs. So that sense of the energy and the vitality of jazz, especially as it comes into church and enters into conversation with the energy and the vitality of the Holy Trinity, as that Trinity creates community among us, is really one of the essential elements in this Jesus Jazz and Worship project. And we are so grateful for Laura Zarabeski for the wonderful painting she's created. Thanks very much.